Thank you. Thank you. Wow. All right. Well, look, it is great to be back in Jamaica Plain tonight. All through my law school years at Northeastern, I lived here in Jamaica Plain and drunk many a beer here at Doyle's. So it's terrific to be back in this community. JP's values are my values. And I am running for Attorney General because I believe it is critical that the people in Massachusetts have an Attorney General's office that leads the nation. And I want to be the person to do just that. We led the nation on the fight for marriage equality. I led the case to take on the Discriminatory Defense of Marriage Act. It was a case that at the time, a lot of people tried to talk me out of bringing. A case that many thought couldn't be won. The president and the majority of Americans were still behind DOMA. But for me, it was a matter of fairness for 40,000 couples and spouses here in this state who were wronged by that law. And we took that on and we won that fight. And I was proud to build the team and lead the winning argument in court here and to be part of the team that saw the first case in this country strike down that discriminatory law. And that's an example of what an Attorney General's office can do. We led the fight against predatory lenders who wreaked havoc in communities across this state, stripping equity from families and neighborhoods. I led the teams that took on predatory Wall Street banks and unscrupulous mortgage brokers and held those entities accountable to make sure that they were held accountable for what they had done. But I did more than that, because you need to do more than just file lawsuits. You need to think constructively. And I helped to design and oversee a program that's been about keeping families in their homes. We've called it HomeCore. And for the last 18 months, we've worked hard using settlement funds to make sure that distressed borrowers had an advocate in the Attorney General's office who could negotiate with banks loan modifications to keep them in their homes. It's been good for families and it's been good for neighborhoods in helping folks get through some really tough times here. And that's an example of what an Attorney General's office can do. These are fights that reflect my values and who I'll be as Attorney General. You know, I grew up the oldest of 5 kids in a small town in New Hampshire. My mom's a school nurse. My dad teaches history in high school, coaches teams up there, and was the head of his union for a long time. I spent my summers waitressing at Hampton Beach through high school and college, where I got down in Massachusetts to play basketball. I'm the beneficiary of Title IX, and I captained the team at Harvard and then had a professional basketball career overseas. If anybody questions whether I'm tough enough to be Attorney General, just know that as a 5-foot point guard, I stood up to many tall folk in the lane, and I'll be able to do it. But in all seriousness, you know, I do this and I seek this office because I deeply care about the people in this state. And I want to bring proactive, constructive, innovative thinking to that office. And that includes using innovative approaches like the one I used on behalf of people with disabilities. Some of you have heard that education is increasingly being done through new technology. And I met someone a few years ago who told me that Apple and its iTunes program was being used on his college campus to deliver educational content. But he couldn't use it because he was blind, and Apple hadn't programmed it in a way to make it accessible. So I reached out and I called Apple, and we reached a nationwide agreement where they agreed to make their educational technology accessible, and now that's why we have the accessible smartphones that we do. I know what innovation can mean, and I want to be an Attorney General who leads with fairness, transparency, accountability, and innovation. And I want to make sure that at the People's Law Firm, you have a point guard who's going to ensure that you have the most progressive, the most forward-looking Attorney General's office in the country. I ask for your support, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. Well, here's my view on that. I strongly support progressive tax policies. I don't support state policies like the ones we have here that are regressive, where there's a flat income tax, where we're not making sure that those who have the most ability to pay are paying their fair share. So I'm a strong proponent of a progressive tax plan. As a civil rights lawyer, I was formerly the chief of the Civil Rights Division. I spent a lot of time working on income inequality in our communities, making sure that people had access to housing, to jobs, to education. These are core things that really drive the health and well-being of our communities. And so I'm a strong proponent of progressive tax policy and making sure that those who have the least are given the opportunities that they need, and that those who are in the position to pay more contribute their fair share. That's what building healthy communities is about in this state. I realize as Attorney General, I won't have the ability to make all the decisions on these matters, but just know that I will be a champion and an advocate for our shared progressive policies when it comes to tax questions.
All right, great.
Well, I'll speak from my experience as a civil rights advocate. I think sure. The question was asked about our criminal justice system and the incarceration of folks in perhaps disproportionate numbers. And the question was, can we change policies to make sure that those who are charged and convicted of first-time misdemeanors don't go to jail? Is that the question? Don't go to prison. Sure. So, look, I was and still am a strong civil rights advocate and civil rights attorney. I also was an attorney for a short time in the Middlesex District Attorney's Office following my career in private practice at Hale and Dorr for many years. My experience is that there aren't many people in prison. There are no people in prison who are there on a first-time misdemeanor offense. But there are plenty of people in jail still for what we talk about as nonviolent offenses. Sometimes, though, with that, they've also been charged with a firearm possession, and that's what's ending them up many times in prison. I will tell you what, though. My view on criminal justice reform is this. We need to be doing all we can to shift attention and resources to the front end, to programs directed at mental health, addiction, both prevention and treatment, and programs we think about as diversion, meaning alternatives to incarceration. Because I know that for every day somebody spends in jail, the likelihood that they recidivate goes up. Okay? So I am deeply committed to convening folks together to move forward on that agenda as Chief Law Enforcement Officer, as Attorney General. I'm also deeply committed to making sure that we provide the tools and the resources to those who are in jail. If we don't give them job training, life skill work, mental health counseling, and the like, they're going to get out and they're going to get into trouble. And I want to give people the tools to succeed when they get out of jail. So know that I will be a proponent of needed, smart criminal justice reform, and I have the ability, having had experience both as a civil rights attorney and as a prosecutor, to get this done. Well, let me give you my position on gun violence. It's a critically important issue, and as somebody who wants to be Attorney General, to continue to fight for equality and fairness across a range of issues, I know it's incredibly important that we get a handle on gun control, on gun violence, and what's happening in homes, on our streets, and in our communities. My approach on gun violence is this. First of all, here's what we need to do. We need to close the loophole on private sales of guns. We need to ensure universal background checks for those looking to purchase guns. We need to increase the number of resources for mental health counseling, behavioral health counseling, and work to identify those who may harm themselves or other people. And we need to enforce drug trafficking laws. 60% of the crimes gun homicides here in Boston are committed by guns that come in illegally trafficked from out of state. And I want to bring together the teams to take on those elements that I just set out. I've reviewed the task force report out of the legislature and studied the proposals that are currently being debated within the legislature. And as Attorney General, as Chief Law Enforcement Officer, I want to bring together district attorneys, community groups, religious organizations, schools, and healthcare providers all together to try to move the ball on those elements I just articulated. We are not going to reduce or end gun violence until we address some of the root causes of gun violence. And that means mental health, it means behavioral health, it means access to jobs, it means access to safe housing, and it means education. And I will be a proponent and a supporter of all those initiatives because I think you really need a multifaceted approach to combat this problem. In terms of veterans, I have deep respect for veterans. I'm from a military family. My dad was a captain in the Navy, and I oversaw the Attorney General's office's work to provide resources for veterans and service members, many of whom are returning now and suffering from PTSD and other things. So I'm very mindful of their needs and will be attentive to their needs, but we absolutely need to do all we can to get a handle on reducing gun violence. Let me say that there are certain things as Attorney General that I can control and other things that I can't control but will nevertheless be an advocate for. We need to raise the wage. And with any wage increase, we need to make sure it also increases with the cost of living. Really important. Second, we need a progressive tax structure. Really important. And third, we need to support unionization. In my experience, particularly as a person who oversaw the Fair Labor Division, I know that when workers have an opportunity to band together and bargain, the health and well-being of those families and working families improves and our economy improves. So that's important. Now, what can I do as Attorney General apart from advocacy? I'm going to continue to do what I've done in my tenure there in the office as Chief of the Civil Rights Division and as the person who oversaw the Public Protection Bureau. I'm going to make sure that we tackle predatory student lenders in the same way that we tackled predatory banks. We have schools out there that purport to offer people a leg up, certificates that are going to get them a job, when at the end of the day, they just take their money and they leave them with a boatload of debt. I am going to shut down those predatory practices. I'm going to make sure that we enforce fair housing laws. I've seen too many times, I've handled hundreds of cases and overseen hundreds of cases where people were discriminated against and denied housing by a landlord because they had a Section 8 voucher. That's wrong, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen. I will make sure that when people have insurance and they're seeking coverage for services, that they get the coverage that they signed up for. These are real pocketbook issues. And whether it's payday lenders, who market to people in the community, particularly those who are lower income and may not use traditional banking services, these are really predatory practices that continue to grow the divide and grow the inequality in our communities. And as Attorney General, I will have the power to enforce the laws to make sure that we have fairness, that we have equality, and that we have justice. Those are some of the things I'll look to do. Well, to clarify, the case I argued was the first case here in Massachusetts, so it was in the federal court in the First Circuit. We wanted to argue in the Supreme Court, but some later filed actions got actually taken up at the Supreme Court. So we were filing an amicus brief. But it's the same deal. What it's like, it's my job. I've been an attorney for the last several years, and this is my job, to be in courtrooms and to represent the people of Massachusetts. There was no greater pride that I took than to stand up and say, Maura Healey on behalf of the Commonwealth. And certainly in that case, I couldn't have been more proud. And at the time, I'll tell you, we didn't know how it would go. As is often the case when you bring a case, you don't know how it'll go. But I was confident that we could state the case, we could make the case for equality, we'd done our homework, and we would win. So it was work, it was business as usual for somebody like me, but it was certainly an honor, and I couldn't have been more delighted with the result, I'll tell you that. And everything that's followed. Every single marriage equality case that was filed after we won here in Massachusetts around this country has been a win. And I understand what we set in motion with that case, and that's what I mean when I talk about advocacy out of the Attorney General's office. It is advocacy that the people of Massachusetts deserve, it is what you should expect, and it's what you're going to get if I'm your next AG. Well, look, I oversaw all the hate crimes prosecution in the Attorney General's office, and I saw it here. People would be surprised that the level, and you probably wouldn't, sir, because you've observed it, the level of bias and hate that exists still within communities here across the state. And I brought and oversaw many a case where we went after those perpetrators of hate crimes. We also made it a point to train police and law enforcement to work with the victims of hate crime, because that's how you ensure better enforcement and better protection of people's rights. Any of these scenarios, I'll tell you what I do in that instance. I would get right after it, talk to the local officials in that area, understand exactly what is going on with that person, what is driving that person to take that act. As a civil liberties lawyer, I do respect the First Amendment, and there are lots of bad and nasty things that we allow people to do. But I'd look at the facts of that and certainly do everything. Whether or not we could make out a case, whether we could make out the elements of an actual case, I don't know. But I'd certainly do everything to advocate against that kind of injustice, that kind of discrimination, that kind of indignity. There's no place for that in Massachusetts. So for those of you who don't know, the Attorney General's office has the ability to bring cases on our own behalf, on behalf of the state of Massachusetts. We also have the opportunity to band together with other states and bring action. We also have the opportunity to weigh in on cases that other people have brought by filing these friend of the court briefs, amicus briefs. My guiding principle, and I was in charge of that for half of the office, across all those areas that Annie articulated, was to make a decision of whether or not it was helpful and in the public interest. That's what guides how you do your enforcement work. I'll tell you, when the federal legislation was challenged, Obamacare was challenged, our office filed a very important amicus brief in the Supreme Court to demonstrate the success of health care reform here. It was a case and a brief that was cited by the Supreme Court in upholding that law. Massachusetts should be a voice nationally, because I think that I think we're all better served when our experience and our expertise is given voice in actions around this country. And I want to continue to do that as Attorney General. You know, it's what we did in the Supreme Court when it came to the DOMA case and when it came to the Prop 8 case. We filed a brief on behalf of a number of states who we got to join with us, a friend of the court brief advocating against discrimination. I oversaw the Environmental Protection Division, where we joined together with many states to challenge industry's efforts to fight against regulation, much needed regulation on climate change. I worked with other states to file suit to rescind some regulations that George Bush had put through at the 11th hour that would have cut women's access to emergency contraception. So I've seen times where it's been successful to band together with other states and either file a lawsuit, like we've done on the environmental front, or to file friend of the court briefs. I've also seen times, though, where it's made sense to go it alone. You know, when we took on predatory lending, I oversaw and brought the first civil rights case against a predatory lender in this country for practices that were having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Other AG's offices weren't prepared to make that case. They hadn't done the homework and studied the data. So you don't want to wait. So sometimes it makes sense to go it alone. I can tell you, when we brought DOMA, we had no friends. Nobody wanted to join in that fight. Now, years later, they did. But there are times when the Attorney General needs to go it alone, and there are times when the Attorney General better serves the people here in Massachusetts by banding together with others. I know the difference. I know what'll work, and that's the kind of discretion I'll exercise and use in the office. Yep. Well, I share in that criticism. Having tried unsuccessfully to work with the federal agencies on some of these initiatives, I see and understand the failures and the criticisms. I'll tell you what we did in Massachusetts, though. We brought civil cases, we brought criminal cases against banks, mortgage brokers, those who were offering foreclosure rescues that turned out to be schemes. We used all the tools in the toolkit here in Massachusetts to protect people. And part of what I talked about earlier, the Home Corps program, when we did band together with the federal agencies, we used some of that settlement money to fund that program. This is why this relates to my comment of a few minutes ago, that sometimes it is better for the state to just act on its own and not leave it to the hands of others. So that's certainly the mentality and the view that I'll bring going forward. I look to be aggressive, I look to be smart, and I look to use all the tools at my disposal as Attorney General to make sure that the public interest is being protected. That's what we're here for. That's what your AG is here for. That's why it's a people's law firm. That's a matter that's now before the legislature to consider and to figure out. It is clear, both from the United States Supreme Court and our state Supreme Court, that you cannot sentence juveniles to life without parole, without the eligibility for parole. Having worked a lot with children, whether it's on bullying issues, whether it's on hate crimes. I understand the difference between a juvenile mind and an adult mind. I also understand that we don't all start from the same baseline. And there's a lot that goes into and contributes to some of the bad behavior that we see. I'll tell you, that's an issue that where I appreciate the concerns, because some of these crimes, you get the folks who were sentenced under these crimes, many were convicted of crimes that were really terrible, and the victims and their families are certainly due their protection and our sympathy. That said, I'm somebody who understands and will follow the law, both out of the Supreme Court and out of the state court here. And you know, going forward as this debate continues, I think that there needs to be somewhere a range, somewhere between what is currently proposed, 15 years and 35 years, to deal with those hopefully infrequent situations. I will tell you, I oversaw the preparation and filing of countless briefs begging the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to take action. Okay? I'm sad to report we haven't been successful. Okay? It's been a very discouraging situation when you talk about the real public safety concerns at that facility and the degradation of the plant. So I will continue to be an advocate. I will continue to fight on issues of public safety like that. And I think, you know, it's a story to be continued, but certainly we need to continue, as of the Attorney General's office, to advocate on people's behalf.
To my mind, it's just one hurricane away from possible devastation.
Yep. I understand. You know, the town I grew up in New Hampshire, I referenced earlier, is Hampton Falls. It's 3 miles from Seabrook. And I grew up with the Clamshell Alliance protesters camping out in my backyard when my dad was a town selectman. So I understand this issue, and I understand deeply the concern that people have about what are we doing with the waste, what is the current safety of the facility, post-Fukushima, absolutely. And all I can say is that I will continue to be an advocate for the public interest on that.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Maura.
All right, thank you all.